If you were living in a Viking settlement during the 9th or 10th century, the word winter didn't just mean colder weather and a bit of snow, it meant a months-long trial of survival. Your year would revolve around one central task, making it to spring without starving, freezing, or falling ill. From the moment the short summer began to fade in late August, preparations would dominate almost every waking moment. Your home was likely a longhouse, a single, elongated building made of timber, turf, or stone, depending on what was locally available. In coastal Norway, turf roofs kept in precious heat. Inland, where timber was plentiful, thick logs formed the walls. Longhouses could stretch over 60 feet in length, sheltering not just your family but also your livestock, cows, sheep, goats, whose body heat was an essential part of keeping the interior warm. The air inside was thick with the mingled smell of animals, humans, and the ever-present smoke from the hearth. There was no chimney. Smoke simply escaped through gaps in the roof or drifted around the rafters, which meant your eyes often watered and your clothes absorbed a permanent campfire scent. The first order of winter survival was food preservation. Without refrigeration, the Vikings relied on salting, smoking, fermenting, and drying to keep food edible for months. Salt was expensive and not always readily available, so smoked meat was common. Fish, cod, herring, or salmon, was often air-dried into stockfish, which became hard as wood and could be eaten months later after soaking. Butter and cheese were stored in wooden tubs, often buried in cool pits. Grain, once threshed and winnowed, was stored in sacks or barrels, carefully guarded against rodents. For vegetables, the options were limited. Cabbages, turnips, and onions stored well and were staples of the Viking winter diet. Root vegetables could be buried in sand to keep them from rotting. But for most, the diet in January and February became monotonous, heavy on salted meat, dried fish, porridge, and flatbread. The risk of scurvy was real, especially in inland communities far from the coast where fresh fish and seaweed could provide essential nutrients. Clothing was another major concern. Winter gear meant layers of wool, linen undergarments, and cloaks fastened with bronze or iron brooches. Wool was not just warm, it was water-resistant, a critical advantage in the slushy coastal winters. Leather boots lined with fur kept feet from freezing, though they were not waterproof in the modern sense. Mittens were common, sometimes knitted in a nail-binding technique, which produced a dense, almost felt like fabric. Firewood was the silent currency of winter survival. A family needed a staggering amount to last until spring. Much of summer's labor went into cutting, splitting, and stacking wood. In treeless areas, peat or dried animal dung became fuel substitutes, though they produced less heat and a distinct, earthy odor. Lighting came from oil lamps carved from soapstone, fueled by animal fat, their dim glow creating a perpetual twilight indoors. The darkness itself was perhaps the greatest psychological challenge. In the far north, the sun might not rise for weeks. Work continued indoors, repairing tools, weaving cloth, carving utensils, but the long nights could weigh heavily on the mind. Storytelling, music, and board games like Nafatafel were essential for morale. Yet even the best preparations could be undone by an early freeze, a poor harvest, or an outbreak of illness. Fevers, infections, and injuries became more dangerous when travel to neighboring farms was limited by snow and ice. A simple broken bone or infected wound could be fatal. The Vikings were no strangers to death in winter, but they also understood the rhythm of endurance. Every salted fish, every neatly stacked pile of firewood, every carefully patched cloak was an act of defiance against the season's cruelty. pain, and garlic for infections. But medicine was limited, and healing was as much about endurance as treatment. The long nights tested the mind as much as the body. Even for a people accustomed to hardship, the isolation could bring on a deep weariness. Winter festivals like Joel were vital for morale, gatherings where families exchanged gifts, feasted on the best of their stores, and honored the gods with toasts of ale or mead. These celebrations, held around the winter solstice, were both a religious duty and a reminder that light would eventually return. Yet after the festivities ended, the daily grind returned. Weaving continued by lamplight, creating warm clothing and blankets. Men repaired fishing nets, farming tools, and sleds. Children were given small chores, fetching water, tending the animals, though play was not forgotten. Carved wooden toys, bone dice, and storytelling kept them entertained during the darkest days. In the stillness of night, when the wind howled against the walls and the fire burned low, you might find yourself listening for the distant crack of ice on the fjord, or the eerie calls of wolves hunting along the frozen ridges. The world outside was vast, silent, and indifferent to your survival. Yet there was a quiet determination in these months, a belief that with discipline, resourcefulness, and the favor of the gods, you could make it to spring. Every morning that you woke to find the fire still burning and the food stores intact was a small victory. But as the snow piled higher and the meat rack grew emptier, one question lingered: how much longer could the supplies, and the people, endure? By late March or early April, depending on your latitude, the change came slowly at first, a day when the ice on the fjord creaked more loudly, when water began to drip from the eaves, when the air carried the faintest hint of earth beneath the snow. After months of gray and white, the first patch of bare ground looked almost unreal, a reminder that life existed beyond winter's grip. The thaw was not a sudden relief, but a delicate and dangerous transition. Ice still clung stubbornly to shaded paths, snowmelt swelled rivers to dangerous levels, and the mud could swallow the wheels of carts or the hooves of animals. Travel became possible again, but it was exhausting and often hazardous. Inside the longhouse, the season of reckoning began. By now, every family knew exactly how well their winter preparations had succeeded. For the fortunate, there were still a few sacks of grain, a handful of dried fish, and maybe even a small cask of ale left untouched. For others, the last weeks of winter had been a slow slide into scarcity, meals shrinking, hunger gnawing at the edges of sleep. It was during these final weeks that the social fabric of the Viking community showed its strength, or its strain. Neighbors might share food, especially with kin, but charity had its limits when every household was balancing its own survival. Debts made in winter were repaid in summer, whether through labor, goods, or loyalty. Those who had failed to prepare adequately might be judged harshly, especially if they were known to have been idle during the harvest season. With the ice retreating, fishing became a daily priority again. Nets were repaired and cast into the cold waters, often yielding the first fresh food many had eaten in months. The taste of new-caught fish after a long winter of dried and salted meals was almost a shock, a reminder of abundance after deprivation. Livestock that had been kept indoors were finally driven outside to graze, their ribs visible after the long confinement. The weakest animals sometimes did not survive the transition, collapsing in the fields from exhaustion or malnutrition. Rebuilding herds was a slow process, and every loss would be felt in the year ahead. The psychological weight of winter began to lift, but not without leaving its mark. The season had claimed its share of lives: elders who did not see the spring, children taken by illness, hunters lost in sudden storms. Each death was remembered in quiet moments, during the first gatherings on the green fields or in the hushed telling of winter's hardest nights. And yet, as the earth warmed and the first shoots of grass appeared, a new cycle began. Plowing and planting demanded energy and focus, fishing and trading resumed, voyages were planned for the summer months. Winter was set aside in thought, if not in memory, as the community turned toward the business of growth and preparation for the year ahead. Still, every Viking knew the truth: the next winter was already on its way. Each sunny day in spring was also a warning, a reminder that the months of light and warmth were fleeting, and that survival was not an achievement you could keep forever. It had to be earned again, year after year. And perhaps, as you stood on the threshold of your longhouse, watching the last of the ice drift away on the fjord, you might wonder, would next winter be easier, or would it be the one that truly tested every ounce of your endurance? When you imagine a Viking, you might picture a weather-beaten warrior with tangled hair, a beard full of crumbs, and the unmistakable aroma of weeks at sea. Popular culture has painted them as filthy marauders, but the reality of Viking hygiene is both more interesting and, in some ways, more complicated. If you were to step into a Viking settlement in the 9th century, one of the first things you might notice is that these people took grooming seriously. Archaeologists have uncovered countless personal grooming tools from Viking-age graves: combs made from bone or antler, ear scoops for cleaning wax, tweezers for plucking hair, and even nail cleaners. These weren't rare luxury items, they were common possessions, suggesting that hygiene and appearance mattered to almost everyone. In fact, in England, where Vikings often raided and later settled, locals sometimes complained that these Norse newcomers bathed too often, once a week. In a world where many bathed only a few times a year, weekly washing stood out. The Vikings even had a dedicated day for bathing, known as laggerdag, washing day, which survives in the modern Scandinavian word for Saturday, lørdag in Danish and Norwegian, lørdag in Swedish. Bathing, however, did not mean immersing yourself in warm, soapy water every time. In summer, rivers, lakes, or even the sea provided a place to wash. In winter, water was heated over the fire and poured into wooden tubs, or steam baths were used, a tradition still alive in modern Scandinavian saunas. Soap was made from animal fat and lye, giving it a strong, sharp smell that would cut through dirt and grease but was far from gentle on the skin. Hair was a point of pride for both men and women. Long hair, carefully brushed and sometimes braided, was common, and men often sported well-maintained beards or mustaches. Lice, however, were an unavoidable reality, and combing was as much about removing pests as it was about keeping hair neat. Combs often show wear patterns that suggest daily use, and in some cases, they were fine-toothed specifically to catch lice eggs. Clothing, too, played a role in hygiene. Wool garments, while warm and water-resistant, could trap odors if not aired out regularly. Linen undergarments, softer against the skin, were often changed and washed more frequently than outer layers. Washing clothes in rivers or at communal wash areas was hard work, involving soaking, scrubbing, and beating fabrics against stones or wooden boards. Yet, for all their grooming habits, Vikings were not immune to the smells and grime of daily life. Their longhouses were smoky, crowded, and filled with the scent of animals, food, and unwashed bodies. Waste disposal was primitive, often just pits dug away from living areas, and the smell in summer could be overwhelming. Personal cleanliness could only go so far when your living environment was inherently dirty. Still, compared to many of their contemporaries, Vikings were considered unusually clean. A well-groomed appearance was more than just comfort, it was social currency. Looking presentable could help in trade negotiations, attract potential spouses, and show respect to the gods during rituals. But this raises a question: if the Vikings cared so much about cleanliness and grooming, what did they do about the biggest challenge to hygiene in their world, disease and parasites that no amount of combing or bathing could completely prevent? Even the most diligent Viking with the finest comb and the cleanest linen could not escape the realities of life in the early medieval North. For all their bathing and grooming, there were limits to what personal care could accomplish in a world without germ theory, modern sanitation, or antibiotics. One of the most persistent enemies of Viking hygiene was the louse. Head lice, body lice, and fleas were an everyday nuisance. Combs, as mentioned before, were a key defense, and many were carved with extremely fine teeth to snag not just the adult insects but also their eggs. Bedding and clothing were regularly aired outside, even in winter, to expose parasites to the cold. In some cases, clothing was boiled, but wool could shrink or be damaged by heat, so this was a last resort. Beyond insects, intestinal parasites were a near-universal problem. Archaeological studies of Viking latrines and waste pits have revealed the eggs of roundworms, whipworms, and liver flukes. These came from contaminated water, undercooked meat, or food prepared on unclean surfaces. Without knowledge of microbes, Vikings relied on herbal remedies for treatment. Plants like wormwood and tansy were brewed into bitter teas believed to drive out worms from the body, though these treatments were often only partially effective. Disease was another ever-present threat. Leprosy, tuberculosis, and various fevers circulated among Viking communities. The crowded conditions inside longhouses in winter created perfect environments for illness to spread. Smoke from the central hearth, while essential for warmth, irritated lungs and likely worsened respiratory problems. Waste management played a major role in both hygiene and disease control, or lack thereof. Human waste was usually collected in pits away from living spaces, but in the winter months, chamber pots were sometimes used indoors to avoid dangerous trips outside. These pots would be emptied as needed, but the combination of poor drainage and livestock waste meant that settlement areas could become unhygienic very quickly, especially after heavy rain or snowmelt. Interestingly, the Vikings also used bathing and grooming in diplomacy and trade. Cleanliness could set them apart from other medieval peoples, making them appear more respectable, and perhaps more trustworthy, to potential allies or business partners. In some accounts, Anglo-Saxon women were said to prefer the company of Vikings partly because they combed their hair every day, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes often. Whether this was admiration or a complaint is left to the reader's imagination. However, it's important to remember that clean is relative. A weekly wash in a wooden tub with strong lye soap, surrounded by smoky air, livestock, and waste pits, would still fall far short of modern hygiene standards. A Viking who prided himself on his appearance might still carry lice, suffer from chronic cough, and harbor intestinal worms. By keeping up appearances, clean hair, well-trimmed beards, neat clothing, Vikings projected health and strength, even if their bodies told another story beneath the surface. But that leads us to the final piece of the puzzle. How did Vikings balance their grooming habits with the challenges of seafaring, raiding, and long voyages, when fresh water and clean clothes were often scarce for weeks at a time? For all their weekly bathing routines and careful grooming on land, Vikings often faced their greatest hygiene challenges when they took to the sea. Life aboard a longship was cramped, wet, and exposed to the elements. On a voyage, there were no spacious longhouses with fires and tubs, just a wooden deck, a sail, and the open sky. The longship's design, though perfect for speed and navigation in shallow waters, left little room for privacy or comfort. The crew slept on the deck or beneath awnings, wrapped in woolen cloaks and furs. Bedding was rarely dry for long, salt spray, rain, and damp air soaked everything. Wet wool has a distinct, pungent smell, and after days at sea, even the most fastidious Viking could not keep it fresh. Fresh water was precious and carried in barrels. It was used sparingly for drinking, not washing. Saltwater baths were an option, but they left skin itchy and hair stiff. Lye soap was useless in seawater, so grooming routines often shifted from actual bathing to simply combing, scraping, and shaking out clothing to remove dirt and insects. Food preparation on voyages was another source of mess. Meals often consisted of dried fish, hard bread, and preserved meat. Cooking was done in small, controlled fires built in iron trays filled with sand, but this was rare on the open sea for safety reasons. More often, food was eaten cold, and greasy fingers were wiped on clothing or rinsed with seawater. Despite the limitations, grooming tools were carried on voyages. Small combs, tweezers, and even tiny mirrors have been found in burial sites of known sailors. The mirror was not vanity, it was a practical tool for checking wounds, removing splinters, or inspecting lice bites. A well-kept appearance could boost morale, especially when arriving in a foreign port where first impressions mattered. Upon reaching land, whether in a friendly harbor or after a raid, washing and repairing clothing became a priority. Rivers and streams were used for bathing and laundering, and fresh clothing from storage was put on before meeting locals or engaging in trade. A Viking merchant arriving in clean linen, hair combed and beard oiled, presented himself not as a wild raider but as a respectable trader, a man to be taken seriously. Yet, there was no escaping the cumulative effects of weeks without proper bathing. Skin became chafed from salt and wind, hair tangled despite daily combing, and the constant dampness could cause sores or infections. In many ways, the cleanliness of the Vikings was cyclical: high standards at home, compromised conditions at sea, and then a return to order once back on land. This pattern reveals something important about Viking life: hygiene was not an indulgence, but a necessity woven into their culture. A clean, well-presented appearance was a tool for survival, in trade, in diplomacy, and even in intimidation. To look strong, healthy, and in control was to project power, whether you were selling furs, forging alliances, or stepping onto a foreign shore after a long and grueling voyage. Still, the sea was a great equalizer. No matter how many combs and mirrors a Viking carried, a month on the waves made everyone smell like salt, smoke, and sweat. And perhaps, as the ship finally approached the familiar curve of the home fjord, the greatest luxury of all was not gold or silver, but the promise of a hot wash on Lagerdag. If you were a Viking setting out on a voyage that might last weeks or even months, your world would shrink to the length and width of a longship, a craft typically 60 to 100 feet long, narrow enough to slice through water with speed, yet broad enough to hold crew, supplies, and cargo. It was not simply a vessel for travel, it became your home, your workplace, and your battlefield all in one. The longship's beauty was in its practicality. Shallow drafted, it could slip into rivers and harbors that larger vessels could not reach. A skilled crew could haul it onto shore, repair it, and launch it again within hours. The hull, built from overlapping planks of oak, flexed with the waves, giving it a surprising resilience in rough waters. The single square sail, woven from wool and treated with animal fat for waterproofing, caught the wind efficiently, while oars allowed movement when the wind failed. But living aboard was a test of endurance. The ship offered no private cabins, no enclosed sleeping quarters, and little protection from the elements. Each man's space was essentially the bench where he rode, a width of 2 feet at best. Beneath the bench, personal belongings were stored in wooden chests, which also served as seats. A crew of 40 or more meant constant closeness: you ate together, rode together, slept shoulder to shoulder. Privacy was non-existent. The daily rhythm of life was dictated by wind and water. If the wind was favorable, the sail took the burden, and the crew could rest, eat, or work on repairs. If not, the oars were manned in shifts, each man rowing until his arms and back ached, then swapping with another. Singing was common, not just for morale, but to keep the stroke in time. A poorly synchronized crew wasted energy and risked damaging the oars. Food aboard was simple and unchanging. Dried fish, hard bread, smoked meat, and cheese formed the bulk of the diet. Ale or weak beer was carried in barrels, safer than water, which could turn foul quickly. On longer voyages, barrels of fresh water were rationed carefully. Cooking was rare at sea due to the risk of fire, but when possible, a small iron brazier might be lit in calm weather to warm broth or porridge. Sleep was taken in turns, with cloaks pulled tight against wind and spray. In bad weather, rest was nearly impossible, as waves crashed over the sides and every man was needed to bail water or hold the ship steady. The dampness was constant, woolen clothes became heavy and cold, boots filled with seawater, and salt crusted on skin and hair. The smell of wet wool, tar, sweat, and fish was a permanent part of the voyage. Despite the hardships, there was a sense of pride in being part of a longship crew. The vessel itself was more than wood and sail, it was a symbol of freedom, exploration, and status. To serve on a well-made ship under a skilled captain was to be part of a brotherhood that spanned oceans. Yet the sea was unpredictable. Calm waters could turn to storms without warning, and a voyage could stretch far longer than planned. As the horizon faded into endless gray, you might ask yourself, how long could a man truly call a longship his home before the ocean began to take more than it gave? By the second or third week at sea, the romance of the voyage often gave way to the reality of constant movement and confinement. The horizon became a familiar, unchanging line, the rocking of the ship, once a gentle rhythm, turned into a relentless reminder that the world beneath you was alive and restless. The greatest challenge was endurance, both physical and mental. Rowing for hours at a time was exhausting work, and the muscles of your shoulders, arms, and back ached constantly. Even those not at the oars were rarely idle. Someone had to steer with the great steering oar at the stern, another to watch the sails angle, others to bail water from the bilge or check the ropes for fraying. Then there were the elements. A sudden squall could soak the crew in minutes, chilling you to the bone. Even in summer, the wind on open water was sharp, and without proper layers, hypothermia was a real danger. The wool cloaks that kept you warm on land grew heavy and cold when wet, and drying them at sea was nearly impossible. Sunburn was another hazard on clear days, the reflection off the water was harsh, and many men's skin cracked and peeled after weeks without shade. Navigation required constant attention. Without compasses, direction was gauged by the position of the sun, stars, and the feel of the waves against the hull. Experienced sailors recognized the scent of land carried on the wind or spotted distant birds as a sign that shore was near. Cloudy days and foggy nights were dangerous. One wrong heading could carry you far off course, wasting days or weeks of rowing. Boredom was its own form of hardship. When the weather was calm and duties were light, time seemed to stretch endlessly. Men carved small trinkets from spare wood, told stories of past voyages, or gambled with dice made from animal bone. Singing was a constant companion, but even the best songs lost their spark after being sung 100 times. Personal disputes could flare in the close quarters. A crew might consist of farmers, traders, and warriors from different villages, each with their own habits and tempers. A careless insult, a borrowed item not returned, or an uneven share of food could lead to arguments. Discipline depended heavily on the authority of the ship's leader, often a jarl or seasoned captain, whose word was final in settling disputes. Despite the monotony, danger was never far away. Pirates roamed certain waters, and storms could strike with little. The longship's design allowed for quick beaching to escape trouble, but in open waters there was no escape from the will of the sea. Food and water supplies were another constant worry. Barrels of ale or water could spoil, and even preserved food could rot if poorly stored. Rationing was strict, a piece of dried fish, a hunk of bread, maybe a bit of cheese. Hunger sharpened tempers, and every sailor knew that running out of supplies before reaching land was a slow, miserable death sentence. Still, For all these hardships, there was a certain resilience that grew aboard the ship. You learned to read the wind and the waves, to anticipate the moods of both the ocean and your crewmates. You accepted the damp, the cold, and the aches as part of the price for a life lived beyond the narrow boundaries of the farm and village. But as the days turned into weeks, a question lingered in every sailor's mind: was the promise of distant lands and possible riches enough to outweigh the grind of endless rowing and the uncertainty of the sea's mercy? Life aboard a Viking longship was a test of patience, strength, and endurance, but it was also the forge in which unbreakable bonds were made. Spending weeks, sometimes months, in the close company of the same men meant you came to know them more intimately than perhaps anyone on land. Friendships grew out of necessity. You shared the same cramped benches, the same meager meals, the same bone-deep weariness. You took turns at the oars, your movements matching in perfect rhythm until you could sense your crewmate's strength faltering, and without a word, you would adjust your own pace to help them keep going. A good rower knew when to push and when to let the other catch their breath. Humor became a vital part of survival. A quick joke, a clever insult, or a ridiculous song could lift spirits when the rain fell for days or the wind refused to blow. Stories of past voyages, sometimes true, sometimes exaggerated beyond belief, filled the long, dark evenings. The men spoke of battles won, of strange lands where the sun barely set, and of women so beautiful they could make a man forget his home entirely. There was also an unspoken code of trust. In rough seas, your life depended on the man next to you holding the line, steering true, or hauling you back aboard if a wave knocked you into the freezing water. That kind of reliance bred loyalty. Disagreements that might have led to lasting grudges on land were quickly resolved at sea, because no one could afford to hold on to anger when survival required unity. Even the smallest moments took on meaning. Sharing the last strip of dried fish on a lean day, helping a crewmate mend his cloak, or standing watch for him so he could sleep, these acts were remembered long after the voyage ended. The camaraderie was not forced, it grew naturally from shared hardship. When land finally appeared on the horizon, a strange mix of emotions filled the ship. There was relief at the thought of fresh food, dry ground, and the comfort of an unmoving bed. But there was also an unspoken sadness. For all its discomforts, the longship had become a kind of floating home, and the men aboard had become a family bound not by blood, but by the endless miles of water they had conquered together. Back in the village, life resumed its usual pace, farming, trading, repairing tools. Yet on quiet nights, when the wind carried the smell of the sea, those who had sailed together would glance at one another with a shared look. They had seen the far horizon, endured the endless journey, and returned alive. That was something no land-bound soul could ever truly understand. And in that knowledge, there was a quiet pride, the kind that only those who had lived through the long, lonely days aboard a Viking longship could carry. The snow had been falling for 3 days without pause. It wasn't the kind of blizzard that howled and screamed through the valleys, instead, it drifted down in an endless hush, softening the world into something dreamlike. The frozen fjord lay beneath a crust of white, and along its edge, narrow tracks marked where sledges had passed earlier in the day. From far-off farmsteads and isolated cabins, people had been making the long journey toward Jarl Eirik's great hall. It was the heart of the midwinter celebration, a feast not merely for food, but for the reaffirming of friendships, the binding of alliances, and the telling of stories that would outlive the snow itself. The journey began early for many. Farmers left their longhouses in the dim light of morning, their cloaks heavy with frost, their breath rising in white clouds. Some came on skis, gliding over the frozen ground with practiced ease, carrying baskets filled with gifts, smoked fish, carved wooden cups, skeins of dyed wool. Others trudged beside small sledges pulled by shaggy ponies, their hooves muffled against the snow. The landscape itself seemed to lean toward the great hall, the slope of the land drawing travelers down toward the coast. Along the way, people joined into groups. Voices, once solitary in the cold, began to mingle into a low hum, greetings exchanged, questions asked about the weather on the high passes, or who would be at the feast this year. Even for the Vikings, who were no strangers to hardship, the winter roads could be treacherous. Sheets of ice hid beneath the snow, ready to send an unwary traveler tumbling. The rivers, frozen solid, became new pathways, glistening lanes bordered by frost-coated reeds. Children would sometimes run ahead, laughing, their shouts carrying strangely far in the muffled air, only to be called back by their mothers before they vanished into the mist. The hall itself was still hours away, but its presence was already felt. Some travelers spoke of the smell of roasting meat that would soon greet them, of the warm rush of heat as the heavy doors swung open. Others thought of the music, the sound of the lyre and the steady rhythm of the drum, echoing through the rafters. There was a kind of unspoken excitement in the air, one that wasn't entirely about food or drink. For many, the feast was a time to be seen. Young warriors would arrive in their best furs, their hair braided neatly, eager to catch the eyes of maidens from neighboring villages. Merchants would bring samples of their goods, hoping to make trades under the soft glow of torchlight. Skalds, the storytellers, prepared verses in their heads as they walked, crafting words that might earn them a place by the fire. By mid-afternoon, the road had grown crowded. Lanterns hung from sledges bobbed gently with each movement. The smell of pine smoke began to thread through the air, faint but steady. Snow clung to every cloak and hood, giving each traveler the same pale, dusted look. Here and there, small dramas played out, a horse refusing to cross a frozen stream, a child losing a mitten and watching it tumble away in the wind, a group pausing to share a skin of warm mead. The journey was long, but no one traveled entirely alone, even strangers found themselves side by side, sharing the same slippery bends and frosted ridges. It happened all at once, the land dipped, the trees parted, and there it was, Jarl Eirik's hall, standing like a dark ship in a sea of white. Its roof was thick with snow, the ridge lined with carved dragon heads that seemed to peer down at the approaching guests. From its chimneys, smoke rose in steady columns, carrying the scent of pine and roasting meat far into the evening air. Even from a distance, the sound reached them, laughter, the faint thud of a drum, the rise and fall of voices speaking over one another. The hall's outer torches burned with a steady orange flame, marking the entrance like a beacon. The travelers quickened their steps. Some began to sing, their voices ragged but warm, carrying the old songs that spoke of winters past and feasts long remembered. Snow crunched beneath boots and skis as the last stretch of the journey disappeared beneath them. They were almost there. And inside, beyond the thick oak doors bound with iron, the feast waited, a world of firelight, warmth, and the kind of stories that would last until the snow melted and the fjord thawed. The heavy wooden doors groaned as they swung wide, letting in a gust of frigid night air and a flurry of snowflakes that scattered across the packed earth floor before melting into small, darkened patches. The hall's firelight spilled out into the night, welcoming the last few guests who had been delayed by the thick snow drifts on the path from the outer farmsteads. Their boots were heavy with frost, and their cloaks glittered faintly with ice, but as soon as they stepped inside, the warmth and scent of the feast enveloped them like an old friend's embrace. The cabin hall was no grand royal court, the beams above were thick, the rafters low enough that even a tall man could touch them, and the walls were lined with simple woven hangings to keep out drafts. Yet tonight, it had been transformed. Fir branches, cut from the nearby woods, had been woven into garlands that draped across the beams, filling the air with the faint scent of pine. In the corners, candles flickered in shallow iron dishes, their light catching the glint of polished drinking horns and the golden edges of carved wooden plates. A long table dominated the center of the room, hewn from a single massive plank, its surface scarred from years of use but tonight hidden beneath a patchwork of linen cloths. On it lay the bounty of weeks of preparation, whole roasted haunches of venison glistening with rendered fat. Thick loaves of dark rye bread still warm from the oven, wheels of tangy goat cheese sliced into wedges, and bowls of pickled cabbage that added a sharp, briny tang to the air. At the head of the table sat Erik Thorson, the host of this gathering, a man whose shoulders seemed broad enough to carry the very rafters above him. His beard was streaked with silver, and the fine lines at the corners of his eyes deepened as he laughed, lifting his horn in greeting to each new arrival. Though he was not a chieftain, his respect was well earned. His family had held this land for generations, and in winter, his hall became a place where kin and neighbor alike gathered not only for food, but for the weaving of alliances that would last until the spring thaw. Music drifted through the air, not the loud, driving beat of the summer gatherings, but something gentler. A young man sat near the hearth, plucking at the strings of a small lyre, his head bowed, his fingers moving slowly, as if coaxing warmth from the instrument. The melody was joined by the soft rhythm of a frame drum, tapped lightly by a woman seated on a low stool, her eyes half closed in concentration. The sound was almost like a heartbeat beneath the chatter of the guests. Platters were passed from hand to hand, and with each bite, the tension of the cold months seemed to melt away. Here, inside, the wind and ice were only stories to be told between mouthfuls of roasted meat. Laughter rolled down the length of the table, sometimes booming and sometimes just the quick, private chuckle of two friends sharing a memory. As the evening deepened, the first round of toasts began. A young farmer stood, swaying slightly as he raised his horn. To the winter, he called, his voice a little too loud. To the long nights that give us time to dream, and the short days that remind us to live. A murmur of agreement rose from the others, and the toast was echoed, horns lifted, mead spilling over the rims in golden arcs. That caught the firelight before landing on the rush-covered floor. Stories followed, tales of hunts gone wrong, of storms weathered on the open sea, of strange omens in the night sky. Each storyteller seemed determined to outdo the last, and though some stories were met with roars of laughter, others were listened to in silence, the audience leaning in as the flames cast shifting shadows across their faces. In one corner, a group of children sat cross-legged, chewing on hunks of bread and whispering to each other, their eyes darting toward the high table where the elders sat. They knew that at some point in the night, the oldest among them, Sigurd the Skald, would rise and speak. His voice carried the weight of memory, and his stories were not the kind you could hear in the marketplace or from a passing traveler. They were rooted deep in the land and the blood of the people here. When Sigurd finally did stand, the hall grew quiet. He leaned on his staff, his frame thin but steady, and began to speak of a winter long ago, when the fjord had frozen so deeply that one could walk from shore to shore. He spoke of a feast held in another hall, in another time, when a guest had arrived uninvited, a stranger who would go on to change the fate of the host's family for generations. His words were slow, deliberate, and each one seemed to settle into the listeners like snow settling on a quiet field. The night wore on, and the mead flowed freely. Some guests began to drift toward the hearth, stretching out on benches or curling into the shadows with their cloaks pulled over them. Others remained at the table, still eating, still talking, as if trying to keep the cold outside at bay for as long as possible. In a small alcove near the back, Erik sat with two of his oldest friends. Their voices were low, their eyes darting occasionally toward the rest of the hall. This was the other purpose of the feast, not just to fill bellies and lift spirits, but to speak of matters that could not be discussed in the open. The music softened, the candles burned lower, and the air grew heavy with the mingled scents of smoke, meat, and spilled drink. Somewhere outside, the wind rose again, rattling the shutters. But inside the hall, it was as if time itself had slowed, holding the night in place. And so the feast continued, the fire crackling, the stories weaving one into another, until the line between past and present began to blur. For in a Viking winter hall, the night was not merely a span of hours, it was a world of its own, warm and fleeting, yet held in the memory like the lingering taste of mead on the tongue. By the time the bridge reached its 3rd and 4th centuries of use, the structure had witnessed more than most people could comprehend. It had stood through wars, floods, and the slow march of changing trade patterns. It had been the pride of the local town when first completed, and though its arches now carried the grime of centuries, the bridge remained an essential artery. Yet change was coming, slowly and quietly, in a way that few of its daily users truly noticed. The river it crossed had once been the primary route for barges carrying grain, wool, and salt to market. But over time, as roads improved and canals were dug elsewhere, the river traffic declined. The toll-keeper still sat in his little wooden booth, but fewer merchants paid the fee each year. Sometimes entire days passed without more than a handful of carts crossing, and the sound of clattering hooves that had once been constant now came in long pauses. Even so, the bridge had work to do. Farmers from surrounding villages continued to drive their animals across it on market days, their sheep leaving trails of droppings between the worn cobblestones. Town children, with bare feet and curiosity, would walk to the bridge simply to lean over the parapets and drop pebbles into the water, watching the ripples spread. In the evenings, elderly townsfolk liked to stroll its length, exchanging slow greetings in the middle where the stone benches offered a place to rest. Repairs had become more patchwork than proper. Instead of skilled masons replacing entire stones, the town's leaders often hired cheaper labor to fill cracks with lime and grit. Wooden railings installed in certain sections as a modern improvement began to rot within a few winters. The bridge sagged just slightly more each year, so slowly that no one could pinpoint the exact moment when the middle seemed lower than before. It was not that people didn't care, rather, the bridge no longer represented the cutting edge of engineering. Newer bridges were being built of steel and iron upriver, with straight spans that could carry more weight and allowed ships to pass without needing to dismantle parts of the structure. The stone bridge, with its graceful arches, suddenly seemed old-fashioned, a relic of another time. One autumn, a great storm rolled in from the sea. The river swelled and rushed under the arches with a force that locals had not seen in decades. Water lapped at the lower stones, dragging branches, barrels, and even a stray goat carcass downstream. For hours, the bridge trembled under the pressure, and townspeople gathered along the banks, watching and worrying. In the end, the bridge survived, but one of its side arches developed a deep crack that could be seen from shore. Repairs were made, but from that day forward, the crack became a kind of scar, a reminder that even stone could not withstand nature forever. As the years rolled on, the bridge became more of a place for telling stories than for transporting goods. People spoke of ghosts, a mason who had fallen during construction, a toll-keeper who had drowned when his booth slipped into the river during a flood. A young couple last seen walking hand in hand over the bridge before vanishing. None of these stories were written down in the official records, yet they were passed from generation to generation, woven into the town's folklore. In truth, the bridge's greatest value had shifted. It no longer simply connected 2 points across the river, it connected the present with the past. Crossing it meant touching the same stones that merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and lovers had touched for centuries. Each footstep echoed faintly, carrying with it the weight of all those who had walked there before. Eventually, a new bridge was built a short distance away, straight and wide enough for modern carts and wagons. The old stone bridge was closed to regular traffic. Weeds began to grow between its cobblestones, and moss thickened along the parapets. Birds nested in the gaps between stones, and fishermen began to sit undisturbed at its edges. Yet, the old bridge did not vanish from memory. Artists painted it. Poets wrote about it. Tourists, hearing of its history, came to walk its length and imagine the lives it had carried. And on quiet evenings, when the sun dipped low and turned the river gold, it still looked much the same as it had hundreds of years ago, a patient witness to time, holding its place in history without complaint. It is strange to think that a structure built for the utterly practical task of crossing a river could become something else entirely, a keeper of human memory, a silent companion to centuries of change. Perhaps that is the fate of many old things, to outlast their usefulness, but to gain a different kind of worth, one that no toll-keeper could ever measure in coin. And so, as you picture the arches in the fading light, you might wonder, how many more centuries will it stand, and what new stories will future generations attach to its stones?